Welcome to Chaplain Chatter. I'm Kevin, your host. Well, we are entering into the holiday season where so much focus is put on celebrating together as a family. You know, often the first responder's job doesn't permit that to happen. On top of duty responsibilities, let's add a little stress and trauma to the soup. You know, holidays, the pressures that the holidays put on can lead to issues like depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. And again, if we look at the first response world, they get enough of that in the job, and to add the additional stress from the holidays, it can cause a lot of issues. You know, there are pressures to decorate, there's pressure to socialize, to give gifts. That adds financial stress. You know, the holidays can even trigger grief in people because they think of the lost loved ones who have passed on and they're missed and they're not part of the holiday anymore. Well, one aspect of wellness and mental health care for first responders is the availability of a peer support program or a peer support team. Not just during times of crisis, but in the day-to-day issues that faced first responders. So one thing we want to do as chaplains is to work hand in hand with our department's peer support team. Now, this can be really tough. This can be a difficult task to accomplish. Peer support's often an additional duty. Chaplains are considered outsiders and volunteers who may or may not be active as chaplains at all in the department. You know, because most chaplains are not sworn, building trust with the first responders literally takes years to accomplish. You know, I was speaking with an officer at the police department I serve, and he's part of the peer support team, and I said, man, I'd love to get involved. Well, he said to me, well, you know, you chaplains have got to know your place. And I get it. You know, we're outsiders coming into the family, and until we earn that trust, until we have proven ourselves and get behind the badge, that trust is just not going to be there. So it takes years to accomplish, and working with a peer support team as a chaplain can be a difficult thing, but keep at it. Well, in March of this year, 2024, Jared Altick, who is a very dear friend of mine, he's a fellow first response chaplain. He's a chaplain for the Kansas City, Kansas Police Department. He appeared on a podcast called the Policing Matters Podcast. You can find this episode on all the various podcast sites, or you can go to policeone.com. I want to share some of the takeaways from that podcast because they're applicable to any and every chaplain program for first responders. And it focused on peer support teams and chaplains working together. And here's some of the takeaways from this podcast. Number one, the best way to serve our first responders is to be proactive and preemptive in our approach to wellness, mental health, and spiritual care. Now, I came up with a thing called A squared C squared a couple of years ago, well, maybe a decade ago now. But A squared C squared is something that we as chaplains can use to build rapport and trust with our first responder. So the first A is acceptance. It's the act of taking or receiving something offered. It's being favorably received. You know, one thing we have to do as chaplains is we've got to accept our first responder just as they are. They can't fit into any mold. They can't measure up to any kind of special standard. They don't have to be involved in a church. And you know what? They don't even have to know about religion or faith or what's in the Bible. You know, what we have to do is we have to accept the protectors just as they are. We don't have to agree with or condone necessarily their actions or their words, but we've got to accept them without judgment. The next A is availability. We've got to be ready for use as chaplains. We have to be available 365, 24/7. We got to be willing to respond whenever we're called upon. And that means getting out of bed in the middle of the night sometimes. Our first C is confidentiality. This is an absolute must for chaplains. As we're dealing with our first responders, there are times when we're going to have confidential, privileged communication, and we have to prove our confidentiality to our first responders. It's important. Now, obviously, there are times when we cannot maintain confidentiality, when there's danger or of life being lost, whether there's child abuse or dangerous or criminal consequences. We cannot keep a confidential conversation. But confidentiality, those conversations you have when you're on a ride-along, those conversations you have when you're sitting at the station talking to an officer or a firefighter, EMT, those things are things you don't share with anybody except that individual. Chaplains have to be credible. We have to keep our word. We've got to have integrity. If we don't keep our word, if we don't keep our ethical and our moral standards, we're going to lose every bit of trust and every bit of willingness to use us as chaplains. So the chaplain has to be able to be counted upon to do what he or she says. The second takeaway that I got from the podcast was that departments and chaplains must be familiar with innovative approaches to mental health and spiritual health care for the first responder. I was surprised there are wellness apps that are out there that you can load on your phone, answer surveys and questions about your mental health, and be proactive in it, to be preemptive in it. And it can help the first responder get help before it's a very difficult thing to do. So check into those wellness apps. Check into those mental health apps if you haven't done so, and see if your department has them or utilizes them. The third takeaway is that department leadership and chaplains must encourage their first responders to manage their mental and spiritual health. You know, there's still a lot of stigma among first responders to talk about mental health issues, to how trauma and stress are affecting them and their families. You know, I was a paramedic for 20 years, and it was going from one call to the next. If it was a horrific call, you were just told, hey, just push it down, keep going. Let's focus on this next call. And you compartmentalized it. And we talked in a previous podcast about compartmentalizing versus having it in the trauma Tupperware that we can open up and release and dump out. Encourage you to listen to that podcast if you haven't done so. So encourage your department to encourage their first responder to talk about things when things are tough. I also want to encourage you as a chaplain to go forth to your department leadership and discuss the best way for the chaplains and the peer support team to co-labor together. We're after the same things. We want positive mental health. We want positive spiritual health. We want to see our first responders doing their duty on the streets, doing what they're called and they're trained to do. And if we can work together, peer support and chaplains, to enable that to happen, to keep those folks on the streets, then let's do it. So I want to encourage you, keep the first responders on the streets. I want to encourage you to accept them right where they're at, be available to them, ready for use, ready for service. Remember, chaplaincy is a ministry of presence. You want to be in station, on ride-alongs, swinging by just on a moment's notice to say hey and check on folks. Showing up during the mundane is one of the best things you can do, because when crisis hits, they're going to remember that you're there. Exercise strict confidentiality when you're caring for, talking with a first responder. Lastly, be credible. Keep your word. Have integrity. If you don't, you're going to lose all trust. You're going to lose all support from your first responders. Well, hey, that's it for now. I'd love to hear from you with suggestions for future podcasts. Just visit the Midwest Chaplain Network website, mwcn.online, and drop me a note and let me know what you'd like to hear. Hey, as always, we've got your six in prayer, and we will see you next time.